Welcome to Just Business. This week on the show, the Justice Department has officially ruled that Google is a monopoly. What can we learn from this as entrepreneurs, and how does it influence how we think about competition and dominating a market? Then, is burnout actually a useful part of the entrepreneurial experience? And finally, Henry tells us why he switched from Framer to Wix for his new startup's landing page. Henry, what do you think about Google officially being a monopoly?
It checks out, if you ask me. I think it's a pretty large company with a ton of influence and not much when it comes to competition. But I'm curious, kind of, what does that imply? What are the implications of the official classification? Tell me more about how we came to this point.
Yeah. So, for those that don't know, there's been a long court case going on where Google has been sued for anti competitive practices in the search market, particularly. So, the thing that some consumers and other companies have claimed, and the government has backed them, is that Google paying, particularly like Apple, to be the default search engine on the iPhone, as well as owning the Android operating system and making themselves the default search engine across Android and the Chrome browser on desktops, is anti-competitive behavior. It has limited the ability for competition to exist in search. And when was this ruled? August 5th came out that yes, Google is indeed a monopoly. These are monopolistic practices. And now we have to figure out what to do about it, is kind of the background that we're existing in. One particular response that I thought was really interesting to this was from the people at DuckDuckGo, which, if you don't know, is a rival search engine that focuses a lot on privacy. But their recommendations were basically that the Justice Department should ban Google from paying to be the default option on devices. They should present screens that allow people to easily change their search engine preferences on things like Google, Android, and the iPhone. They should educate the public about the differences between the search engines. And then finally, Google should give access to competitors about its knowledge of search and the ad market, which I think is particularly interesting. And I'm sure we have a lot to say about this. That all being said, like, Henry, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on particularly Google being listed as a monopoly, but also your thoughts on us existing in a time when the government's taken down big tech in some ways, and how are we going to break these companies up? Are we trust busting 2.0? What is this?
I don't know if we're there yet, but yeah, I find it interesting, especially in the world of the portal to the internet.
Mm,
It's what kind of search engines
yeah.
are. That will naturally become concentrated,
Mhm.
right? The idea that we're questioning if a company should be able to pay to be the default on a piece of hardware. First, you might have to ask, should there be a default? I think most minds would agree. The answer is yes, right? Like, we want things to be streamlined. We want it to be easy. We want the most popular option to potentially become the default, right? Eliminate some
Or
degree
even
of
the best
choice.
option, maybe.
Actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I feel like a lot of this is natural selection
Hmm.
almost, but where does it become unfair? What is that line? And it seems like that line has been drawn when you control the distribution of a large part of then the remaining part of the market, you're purchasing the right to have exclusive ownership over, or at least default ownership
Yeah.
over, which we know goes a long way. Do you think that is inherently evil?
I don't know if it's inherently evil for there to be a best option. I think that
Mhm.
particularly why we're seeing this court case exhibit now, when I think most of us know and can feel that Google's been a monopoly for a long time, is because there's a lot of conversation about whether Google is getting worse. Google has, for at least the last 5 years, been more and more focused on tailoring search results for individual preferences, mostly to benefit their advertising partners. And the whole mantra of organizing the world's information doesn't seem as much of a focus and a mission for them as of late. And so I think that's why we're seeing this case exist now, is that before, how Google got here is maybe they were the best option, but now best doesn't seem as good for the consumer anymore. And so because of
Mhm.
that, because they've removed themselves from the responsibility of actually providing the best service because they have the market dominance, that's when the government has decided to step in and try to make this more competitive.
Yeah, it brings up the idea in my mind of if the people are not the customer, then they are the
Right.
product, right? So then Google search for the people of the world, we are the product and the customers the advertisers.
Mhm.
So then the incentives line up and the product could go down in quality.
Right.
I guess looking at the theory of the negative outcomes of a monopoly, we agree that maybe the most popular should be allowed to be the most popular, but what happens when a single provider can dominate an industry? You're going to see things potentially like price gap, have unfettered control over what people are willing to pay and what they have to pay to access a certain thing. You have a decrease in quality,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't have to defend against competitors. Does anything else come to mind about kind of negative outcomes associated with monopolies?
The final one I'd say is the effect that it has on the rest of the marketplace and the lack of innovation, right? So in a ideal capitalist system, right, the free market works to create competition between firms in order to push people to compete for the consumer's interest and make the best product. And in a world where there is a major monopoly that can not only bully the actual customers and provide a worse product, but also bully their competition into not existing.
Yeah.
Like that inhibits innovation, which I think is one of the reasons that DuckDuckGo particularly came out with this response and added in that they would want Google to be required to give out their data information on how they do search and their knowledge of how they do ad placement, because that IP, if you will, is the thing that could bolster and make it easier for new competitors to exist in the landscape. Search is so dominated by who has the most data, and Google has the most data. They have an entire infrastructure platform that you can pay for where they host all their data. But having access to that and giving access to that to competitors is like a really interesting solution, I feel. One of the points that I think because I can hear the naysayers now and maybe you'll vocalize for them in some ways, is the idea that that's data that Google owns. Like that's something that they have created in a way. That's an asset that they should get to own, and it's unfair to have them distribute that to other competitors. But I'd say in a lot of ways, in this specific case, that data is not Google's. That data is ours, and so it should maybe be publicly available to all competitors as a natural resource of the internet that should be shared. But what do you think about that, Henry?
Oh man, that's such a good, you know, is it a public good? Should it be made
Right.
public, regulated as such? Is a good question. I feel like the natural progression into becoming a monopoly as the most popular option and potentially engaging in anti competitive practices, as we've been classified as now in the case of
Mhm.
Google, not so good. In my mind, it comes down to the business model. I think it's a combination of being a portal to the internet, which is incredible and revolutionary for everything that we do. But it comes down also to the business model
Mhm.
of subscription, where the people are the customers. So $5 a month to access Google search, or $5 a month for everybody to access the Google Workspace, Google Docs, Google
Mhm.
Sheets. That compared to the current model for the people, which is a free platform, which is ad backed. Clearly, in the free market, my preferences, my interests, my data, my identity is way more valuable to Google to sell to advertisers than it would be to charge me $5 a month,
Mhm.
right? So we don't necessarily have to debate which one is more profitable, but would you solve these problems of decreased quality, anti-competitive potentially, if you were to maybe regulate and say, you cannot be ad backed if you are engaged in a public good, and we are classifying internet search as public good? Do you think is that too radical
I
of even a question? Am I allowed to say that?
I
I don't know.
yeah, the Government's gonna come after you now, or at least all the companies will. No, you're talking to me, so I don't think anything you say is too radical, but I think the idea of trying to declare what we and define what we see as a public good on the internet is something we're not really good at, and is
Yeah.
maybe a next might maybe not a next step, but maybe a 5 steps from now. I think the idea of trying to say that we're gonna have a public good that is search, that is, some default option is very difficult because Google's an international company, search is an international product, and trying to have individual governments declare how their own search tools work is how we go down the path of everybody having their own kind of Chinese equivalent of a search engine, which, I mean, might be a fine path, but to me feels less robust than the solution that is proposed, which is maybe we don't say that Google can't exist as a dominant search engine, but maybe we do say that they can't exist as a dominant search engine by harboring all of the data that you would need in order to make a competitor. And so in that world, I feel like
Mhm.
it's easier to increase competition, increase choice, along with the other proposed solutions of making it very easy for people to switch their default search engine and stuff. Um, but a lot of that will inevitably come down to consumer choice, and it might come out that people still default to Google because that's what we've been trained to do for the past 25 years, almost 30 years. Um, but who knows? I'd be interested to see. The extended question I have for you, Henry, is as entrepreneurs, right? As people trying to build our own businesses, do you think it's ironic in some ways that as a culture we praise like competition, free market, the kind of discussions we're having now, and we also are taught that the end state of our business is to be a monopoly? Like Peter Thiel, the popular tech guy, co-founded PayPal, all that stuff, a weird wackadoo, but he and yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly, sorry. Allegedly, he's a wackadoo. Uh, he has a quote from, I think, Blue Ocean Strategy, or it might be Zero to One, that is, quote, "Monopoly is the condition of every successful business." And I think we really do take that to heart in a lot of business. You're shaking your head, but I think a lot of founders would think of themselves as on a path to trying to build a big market dominant company. And to hold both of these things in our hands, right? This belief in competition and encouraging a free market, and also a belief that in the free market we operate, we'd like to be the dominant player. Do you find tension with that? Is that something you ever think about?
Where I find tension is I feel like many founders and entrepreneurs are encouraged by the idea of being the best. I want my business to be the best at what we do. That is
Right.
encouraging. That is inspiring, right? That's what we want to achieve. But to then add in the layer of greed, so greed with wanting to be, then you go to that outcome of being a monopoly. And it just seems a bit unnecessary. Why can we not be the best, but not necessarily have the principles of preventing competition from all
Okay.
competitors? What's the point of that? That doesn't necessarily make you the
Yeah.
best. That just makes you the biggest and the wealthiest. I would push back that the motivation of business is to destroy competition. I would rather we frame it in a way where the purpose of business is to become the best you do. And that is not linear, right? That's going to change and evolve as the market changes, right? Blockbuster was the best at the time, but that doesn't last forever. So you have to change and adapt. What do you think? Does that make
No, I
sense?
think
Like,
I
is that a miscommunication of become a monopoly? I'm hearing be the best, but it's pushing me to be the worst. And does that resonate?
I think that does resonate. I think it's part of your kind character that you think of those things as separate. I think in for a lot of entrepreneurs that I've discussed this concept with, maybe not as explicitly as you're on a path to become a monopoly, there is a lot of pressure, whether that's internal or external, to become big and to win. And I think winning is different than being the best. Winning is being dominant. Winning is having the most power. Being the best is almost an intrinsic reflection on how you feel about your own motivations of both your company and your product or service, and deciding for yourself whether or not you're meeting those expectations. The extended question that I want to pose to you, in this world where you think about best and biggest as different, do you think that there's any way to be a company that encourages competition in your marketplace or in the market that you exist in? Like, how, and is that something that is the responsibility of you as a business owner? Is that just the responsibility of government? I think Peter Thiel would say it's the
Uh,
responsibility of government to clap back against the monopolies. It's the responsibility of the founders to become a monopoly, right? That's like the extended shareholder value principle. Become big, become the biggest, become dominant. So how do you think about that? In some ways,
feel
is being
like
the best also encouraging your competition? Or is there any way to be the best without having good competition? And then having good competition, is it your responsibility to cultivate those people?
yeah, a kind of loosely put together sports analogy, becoming the best is encouraging competition. If I run faster or I score a certain number of points, that's going to invite someone to compete with me on that same
Right.
field. That's how I view
Yeah.
it in the business world. And it could be too much of a simplification, but generally speaking, you enter business in a certain industry and you can compete on price, positioning, quality, distribution. There are a few big categories that you can try to edge out your competition in. You do that, it could invite direct competition in distribution, for example, or the competitor could say, I'm not going to compete against them in distribution. We're not set up for that. We don't want to do that. We're going to compete with them on price or
Right.
quality or some other area. So I think the idea of best can be subjective, that I'm okay with being big. I just don't know if I would encourage founders to listen to the notion of your aim should be to be a monopoly, because a monopoly in my mind is not just the biggest, but it is an entity that is rejecting competition
Mhm.
and trying to push it down rather than engage in it
Right.
fairly by responding to those factors of price. I don't know. I feel if you reject that, you become a bad guy.
Mm.
You're not going to be doing your best. You might hurt your stakeholders. Your purpose to solve a problem, if that's how we boil down
Yeah.
business, solve a problem and get money in return. If you are a monopoly, you might stop solving the problem as best as you can in order to make more and more, because you're now not responding to
Yeah.
competition anymore because you don't
You
have
might
to.
create
Um,
problems in order to make more money.
might create problems. So then I'm an advocate for
Right.
regulation to prevent the monopoly, but I just don't think that's a good wording of the goal. Be the best is okay. I think be the biggest is okay, but to be the only sole survivor, don't love it. I think that's bad.
Do you think there is a lot of academic theory that the point of, like, to Peter Thiel's point, the point of business is to drive towards monopoly, and like business not as individual businesses, but maybe with nuanced goals and stuff, but business as an entire landscape of a marketplace, that everything in the capitalistic free market drives towards the concentration of power and the concentration of capital, which means the concentration of, like, influence to a customer base in a market in a monopoly. And so something I think about and maybe overthink about is the, in true me fashion, is that if left unchecked as founders, will we become monopolies? Like, will we become, as you put it, the bad guys? And if we think that's true, which I think we're both saying that's true, what are the things that we need to do and think about in order to be good stewards of a competitive marketplace? And that's tough because in some ways it seems like supporting competition is against your incentives. If you thought about doing what Google might have to do, regardless of the Justice Department telling you, like opening up your intellectual property and letting other people use that to either start new businesses or to invent new stuff. I think many people would see that as completely counterintuitive. And there are some examples of it not being counterintuitive, but I'm wondering your thoughts about just saying that example alone. What's the
Yeah.
feeling that you get? What are the thoughts that you have as a business owner?
I personally wouldn't hold myself or anyone else to that standard
Mm,
to give away your competitive edge. I don't think that's a natural tendency, and I don't think that's what the free market would encourage either.
mhm.
So, if that is the best solution that a democratic system has promoted to curb a monopoly and harm to a
Right.
population, I would support it, but I don't necessarily think I would encourage the private sector to do that on their own accord.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't think it is a company's purpose to encourage and support a competitive industry.
Mm,
I think they should focus on themselves and make themselves the best possible. And to an extent, that should be regulated
mhm.
so that it doesn't have negative outcomes. So you do have antitrust laws preventing monopoly.
So you don't think that there's any I think of a world where in order to be competitive, in order to continue to have my company be a bastion of innovation and to drive us forward, at some point, it might be beneficial for us to spin off new companies, right? Like in independent organizations, it might be beneficial to, if a patent is expiring, maybe not make micro improvements to some sort of patent in order to keep it for another 30 plus years. Like
Agreed.
there are some of these small anti-competitive practices that we think of as maintaining a competitive advantage, and at some point it becomes anti-competitive and we're the ones in power, and now the Justice Department has said we're a monopoly. And I guess the question that I'd invite all of our listeners to ask is whether you would want to be in the situation, whether you think it's the nature of business to get to that situation. That's the biggest win. Like you're in Peter Thiel's camp of that's the condition of every successful business. Or if I think like Henry's talking about, and I'm interested to hear more ideas about, you take a nuanced view of how do I be a competitive player and look out for my own, but also look out for the market and make sure that regardless of if it's me or someone else, a dominant player isn't just going to exist and eat everybody's lunch. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think the layer of technology, which we always apply to these business
Right.
questions and in just business, but I think about another industry like ice cream. Is the goal for every ice cream producer to be a monopoly? I don't know. Like, not really. Like, I don't know if we've seen that successfully done.
Mhm.
Maybe we have. There are some big players, but do those big players really just want to crush the other big players? Is it really that much of a war between and
Mhm.
corporations? I don't personally view it that way, but perhaps I'm naive. I'm telling you, I'm okay with a company striving to be the best that it can be. I'm okay with a company striving to be the biggest that it can. But your mindset shouldn't be put everyone out of business and prevent anyone from doing business in my industry.
Mhm.
That seems like a step too far, but maybe that's just the reality we live
Right.
in.
And maybe it's a
Like,
slippery slope to get there. Right.
probably
Right.
is.
And
Probably.
so that's why we ask these nuanced questions, baby, on Just Business. Subscribe. All right. We're transitioning topics. Henry, I've been thinking a lot about burnout this
Mhm.
week. Um, one of the things that I've been thinking about is whether burnout has actually been useful in my life in the past. What are your experiences with burnout? What do you think about this question?
Yeah. Early in my career, I had no concept of burnout.
Mm,
I pretty much worked all the time, all day, every day. My brain really struggled to even turn off thinking about projects or business or work. And then eventually I took a vacation and I realized, wow,
I'm
it
tired.
want to do this anymore. And so I really discovered burnout for the first time. And uh, yeah, I think burnout doesn't feel good,
Mhm.
right? Motivation, feeling lost, and what you want to do and what gets you excited. Burnout feels really bad. And so you'll find a lot of content online about what to do when you experience burnout, which I think my answer to it, we don't have to go down this, but it's just balance.
Mhm.
Living a life of balance with relationships and fitness and food and
Right.
fun and things outside of work. That's something that, as I was discovering that I had some burnout, I did not have balance. Now I have a lot more balance. I feel a lot better. So that's my answer to it. But I think you're more asking, is burnout something that we can use
Mhm.
to our advantage? Not necessarily is it good or bad or why it happened, or maybe a little bit
It
what
happens.
happens.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's good context to hear your experience with that. In terms of my own, I think you could definitely say that when I shut down my company after 3.5 years of us working on it and me working on it full time for that entire period, definitely caused a lot by burnout, right? We had been, is it Sisyphus? What is the guy that pushes the boulder up the thing?
Is that the name?
Who knows? Whatever.
Yes.
Some class,
A Greek
yeah,
tale.
some Greek tale, some classics major will tell us in the comments. But yeah, it
Good.
felt like we were constantly pushing the boulder uphill and that we were never getting to the other side and that the other side wasn't even in view. And so you give up. And in that moment, I had been thinking a lot about something a mentor had said to me early on in the process, which was that your business only dies when you stop working on it. That the only condition actually for failure is you no longer believing that this thing can succeed and no longer making progress towards that goal. And I thought that was really interesting and both sad at the time. And in some ways, I also feel now like that was the only way that like my body and my mind was going to get me to quit. That I was going to take myself to the breaking point of my finances, my like social relationships, all that stuff in order to make it happen. And when that thing broke, it was the universe telling me it's time to quit. These factors are outside of your control. And so might not be choosing for your business to die, but everything else is. Um, and in some ways, I think that was why I bring up this question of is it actually useful? Like in our entrepreneurial mode where we're myopic, laser focused. Like a lot of us are very tenacious and interested in making this big thing happen and believe it. In some ways, maybe the only way that we, for the good of us or our families or our co-founders and all that stuff, that we stop working on it is that we have to burn out. What do you think about
I resonate with a lot of that.
that?
I think the framing of your business only dies when you stop working on really links your personal identity to that business. It's your
Yep.
responsibility to sail this ship. It all is on your shoulders. If you fail, the business fails. If the business fails, you fail. That is a lot to carry just mentally.
Hmm.
Um, I think this does come down to a central question, I think, in my life of how do you decide when to stop.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're asking. You want to persevere. We know that generally in business, if you survive, you'll eventually thrive, right? Like you will be successful if you don't give up. If you figure out how to pivot, how to change, how to react, how to address new competition. If you solve all those questions and just survive, you don't need to do anything
Yeah.
crazy, but if you survive, you'll be okay. But the reality is surviving is so hard.
Yeah.
And so you talk about a startup experience where you're pushing the boulder up the mountain
Mhm.
forever and ever with no end in sight. And even if you did get to the top, then the boulder's just going to fall back to the bottom and you got to roll it all the way
Right.
up. I really feel like you need to balance, and I need to balance my own personal desire, my own personal belief in a product or a project with reactions from other people. I think I have the tendency of isolating myself and saying, I have this great idea. I'm going to work on it. I'm going to push it forward. Maybe I'll test it a little bit. I'll take some feedback and then get back. In theory, that's somewhat good. You want to iterate on the product on your own with some feedback. But I do think there is a point where you should listen to a lack of positive feedback as a decision to stop,
Yep.
right? I think you learn so much working on businesses and projects. Apply that knowledge. But if that knowledge all leads you to, I'm in the wrong industry, or this problem isn't as big as I thought it, or this market isn't wanting the solution I thought it did, you can pivot so much so that you become divorced from your purpose,
Right.
right? I feel like I've seen a lot of startups where they start and they're like, I'm going to build a tool for streamers. And they build this and they talk to all these streamers. And then a few years later, they're building something for TV. You
Totally.
know, that's a success. Like investors are happy, but is the founder really happy to be surviving that long? I personally wouldn't. I wanted to solve that one problem. So I think for me, if feedback you're getting pushes you too far away from your vision, you should feel okay in stopping what you're doing. And the result of that happening could actually cause burnout, right? If you're not getting that positive feedback, you're getting all this negativity
Yeah.
or these pivot requests or feature requests,
Or no feedback. You're
feedback at
completely
all.
isolated and just working on something by yourself with no and you can't get anybody to look at it or talk to you. I think that's the experience for
Yeah.
so many founders.
My heart goes out and I've been there and it sucks. And that's another problem of just not having the distribution, access to your market in order to even present your solution, which is really frustrating. And you never want to shut down for that
Right.
reason. That's one of the worst reasons to have to shut down, but it's definitely valid. Uh, you can do your best to try to answer that, but sometimes you just run out of resources, you run out of time,
Totally.
too far away. But I've been thinking a lot about market timing in the world of business. Like too early, too late, timing is so
Yeah.
much. I see companies that a few years ago are valued at a lot of money, and a few years later, same business, but valued at a lot less. And could be because of, you know, competitive factors, but it's also just the market is an emotional beast and timing is so important. And so there's a lot of factors that I think can lead to burnout. And in my opinion, it can be a good signal to consider stopping and being okay with that.
Yeah, exactly. Listening to your body and the inputs around you that maybe it's time to reflect on the fine question of is it time to quit? Just to your point about like timing, so many of us think, yeah, timing our launch, timing the market in some ways. This is something that people that invest constantly think about. But people that like actually generate wealth in mass, right, actually think about time in market, right? How long can I wait for these returns to compound? And I think in so many ways, that's my advice for a lot of founders. And it has been since I shut down the company is I was burning money, right? We were, yeah, burning a lot of resources. And so we, in some ways, had a definitive deadline. And that affected my emotional state as well, which is one of the reasons I think I burnt out is there was just no more resources to expend. And yeah, the flame died. But if I had taken a different approach where instead of trying to think about rushing, timing, right? This was the beginnings of kind of creator economy stuff, nowhere near what happened when Clubhouse launched. But if I had instead thought about how much time in market we can have, how can I get a job that allows me the flexibility to work on this on the side? How can I lower our costs so that this is basically possible for me to run indefinitely? In that way, to your other point, the returns that come back from that, the compounding returns of the things you learn just from the amount of time you have in market can pay out. But in that way, there's also the flip side of that of if you no longer have those signals or you no longer give yourself the ability to listen to those intense signals of the deadlines, the liminal states of transition, then maybe you won't take the signal that you should quit and work on something else, right? That you should invest your time somewhere
Yeah.
else. But in general, I feel like when the time comes, those deadlines and liminal states always appear. And I never want anyone's deadline or liminal state to be they've run out of money or put themselves in a bad situation, like socially, financially, anything like that. I think we're agreeing burnout is useful. It's a useful signal. We should listen to it and use it as a time to reflect. We should not shame ourselves for having that feeling or for quitting at all. And also, your business only does die really when you stop working on it. So, how can you work on it a little bit at a time for as long as you can and stay focused? Cool. Henry, in our last little section here on the pod, you, sir, are about to launch your I have no idea what startup this is for you, but a new product that you've been working on for a
Yes, sir.
while and is one of the reasons that we met. And tell us about what it was like making your landing page. We're not going to tease. We're going to tease as much as you want. We can have an exclusive about what you're working on. But really, how'd you make the landing page as someone who doesn't know how to code? What was your experience using different tools and what did you decide on?
Yeah, so this is potentially an interesting topic, but more so a short story. As you said, I'm non-technical. I got a lot of ideas. I've started a lot of small businesses, startup-y projects, content creation, and I find that every time I come to build a website, I'm going to use a website service provider, website in a box, whatever, drag and drop, no code, low, something like that. But every time I do it over the last 5 to 10 years, I use a new tool. Like, I just don't stick to one, and it's so sad, and I think it probably is because I wanna do it better, I wanna
Yeah.
optimize, but learning a new tool takes so much time, and I would say normally I'm fairly good at learning new tools,
Hmm.
I do it quite often, but it does take time, and this time around I thought I was gonna be so smart. I was gonna design my website in Figma.
Mm.
Very user friendly. I'm comfortable there. Pick all my fancy colors. And then instead of using a more traditional website builder where I'm limited by certain frameworks, sections, formats, whatever, I would just be able to translate somehow my Figma designs into a functional website without having to code. And there's a few options that allow you to import Figma designs, and Framer is one of
Mm.
them. So I was trying a new tool and took forever. I was about 15 hours in, which was way too long for me personally to build a website. I don't know how that sounds to you or sounds to anybody else, but not ideal in my opinion. Um, and eventually I was able to learn Framer for the most part, get all my custom sections together. The difficulty for me was then making that responsive. That good for all screen sizes was a challenge. And eventually I did it over the 15 hours. But the final step was the menu or the navigation bar.
Mm.
And I just could not figure out how to make it responsive how I wanted. And I said, I could delay the launch, I could work more on this, I could hire somebody, or I could just go back to a tool that I know and get everything mostly the way I want
Mm.
it. And so I did that. And in an hour, I replicated everything that I did in a different platform. I used Wix and I'm happy with it. So I don't know what the lesson is, but I was trying to learn something new. I thought I was being smart, but the actual smart decision was to just do the same dumb thing you always did to be fast and efficient. That's what I'm taking away from
Yeah,
it.
it's so funny. It reminds me in a talk at Stanford once, Steve Huffman, the CTO of Reddit, one of the co-founders, he said something about building product that really resonated with me was you're gonna feel this inclination to do everything bespoke. That the designs that you have or the way that you're thinking about implementing this is the one true approach. It's the only way that's going to work. And so you need to write everything yourself and have complete ownership of this. And at the end of talking about this, he says, but you need to ignore that feeling entirely and use the damn library is the is the thing. And
Yeah,
library being the thing that an engineer knows how to do, that's an abstraction of how something works, and they'll just use that. And this is very resonant. It's like you thought you'd
definitely.
invest in this cool new fun tool, but in reality, the thing that matters is that it gets done, right? And so pick the thing that you already know how to use that can get you to done the fastest. Yeah, super interesting. I think very resonant. I can think of countless examples from my own life of doing something similar.
Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, in general, takeaway: use the thing you know. It's mostly about the content, your messaging, all that stuff. When building a website, it does not matter how you build the website. Um, but Henry, we're excited for your launch. I think potentially next episode we'll talk about it. I think that's going to be great. Anything else?
I think that's a
That's
wrap.
a
What a
wrap.
great
Thank you,
episode.
everyone, for being here. Subscribe on YouTube to Just Business, and we'll catch you in the next one.